In the last section, we wrote our first reducer, the books reducer, and we wired it up to our application inside of this combine reducers function, where the key was the piece of state or the name of the piece of state, and the value was the reducer itself. When we pass this object to combine reducers, we're essentially telling Redux how to create our application state. In this example that we have right now, if we went ahead and ran this in the browser, our application would have a single piece of state called books, where the value was whatever gets returned from the books reducer function. And right now, that's just a list of objects. In this section, we're going to go ahead and make sure that the code we wrote is actually generating usable state for our application. We're going to do this by creating a book list component within React. So let's go ahead and get started by creating a new file inside of our components directory. We're going to call this booklist.js. So again, the only purpose of this component right here is just going to be to render a list of books. So we're going to kind of speed through this component real quick and then get to back to the state topic here. A lot of the topics that we're going to cover in this we've already covered. It's just really, building a list out of a component. So we'll do our boilerplate at the top. We'll write import React component from React, and then we'll create our class. Export default class book list, and it's going to extend component. Inside of here, we'll create our render function, and we're going to have it return a UL with a class name of list group and call SM4. These class names are just part of Bootstrap, just to make things look kind of nice for us as we go through this. And then we'll close the UL tag. And then we're going to go ahead and build our list. Now we're going to pull the list building out to a separate function called render list. If we ever want to call a separate function within our JSX, no problem. Just as before, when we reference any JavaScript variable, we write curly braces and then this dot render list. So then that will call a new function that we'll define called render list, like so. Then inside of here, we're going to pretend, we haven't done this yet, we're going to do it in just a little bit. We're going to return this.props.books. So we're going to imagine, or we're going to plan that we're going to wire up the list of books to be on this.props for the book list. Then we'll map over that array. And for each element in the array, we'll return an li with a class name of list group item, and inside the li we'll put book.title, and then close the li. One thing in here, don't forget we got to add a key because it is a list, so we'll add key book.title. Remember, we just need to use the unique value for the key, so we can just use the title of the book. We're going to relatively sure that that value is always going to be unique throughout the entire list. Okay, so this component looks pretty reasonable. It creates a UL, and then it calls a helper function called this.renderList. This.renderList is going to map over an array of books, which we haven't passed into this component yet, but we will shortly. And for each book in the array, we just create a li that contains the book's title. Cool. So we've got our component here. All we have to do now is plug in our application state into this. Somehow get it into here as this.props.books. This is the merger that we saw in the previous state diagrams. Remember, where we somehow combine our React views and our Redux state to generate what we call a usable application. Connecting these two separate libraries, Redux and React, and do keep in mind they're separate, there's absolutely no intrinsic connection between React and Redux, is done with a separate library called React Redux. React Redux is already included in this boilerplate package, so we can make use of it right away. So here's how we're going to make use of that library. We're going to define one of our components as a container instead of a component. So we've been using the word component all the time here, kind of interchangeable with view. Instead, we're going to promote one of these components to what we're going to call a container. A container is a React component that has a direct connection to the state managed by Redux. So again, remember, we have our data in our application, we have the views in the application, and together they form our working usable app. The left-hand side is Redux, the right-hand side is React. In the middle, you can imagine that we have this new library called React Redux. It's what forms the bridge between these two separate libraries. The only time we ever get this bridge available, where we can take a React component and inject state into it, kind of inject data into it, is a component that we call a container. Containers are also sometimes called in the official Redux docs smart components as opposed to a dumb component. So right now we've got a dumb component right here because it does not have any direct connection to Redux. So containers really end up looking pretty identical to React component, but they are distinctly different. To indicate this difference, we usually separate them into different directories. So right now we've got a components directory. Instead, we're going to put all of our containers into a different directory called containers. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new folder here called containers. And then I'm going to go ahead and cut our book list and paste it into containers. So I'm just moving the file over here. That's all. So we can now create our first container out of this book list. There's just one question left. Which components do we promote to be in a container and which do we leave as normal React components? Before we promote this book list, let's answer that question in the next section.